Albert Gomes was born in Belmont in Port of Spain in March 1911. He was the grandson of Portuguese immigrants who had come almost 100 years earlier. The Portuguese came as agricultural workers from Madeira, an island off Portugal. They, however, did not stay long in agriculture, but turned to the retail business.
He grew up in a Portuguese corner shop in Belmont, Port of Spain, and he himself assisted his parents in selling all kinds of goods and liquor and all kinds of things. He had his primary education in Port of Spain, and then once he became a teenager, his father sent him off to the City College of New York, where he did a course, a diploma, one can say, in journalism. And having completed that diploma, he then returned to Trinidad during the 1930s. And once he returned, he plunged directly into public life, into public affairs, in trade union activity. So we can date his period in the public life of Trinidad and Tobago from around 1937, the time of the Great Strike, right up to 1962, when the West Indian Federation collapsed and when he went into exile in London.
Before Albert Gomes and that group of academics and intellectuals whom he gathered around him, there was very little attempt to create any kind of national literature. The national literature of the Caribbean was British literature because that was what the islands were exposed to. Gomes sought to move away from that tradition and worked to establish a uniquely Trinidadian perspective. He did this through the pages of the Beacon.
The Beacon was possibly the most significant literary journal in Trinidad during the 1930s. There was a little group of people, a coterie, you can say, a circle of young, bright intellectuals of the time, many of whom went on later on to very brilliant careers. So Gomes brought these people together in a little study group, one can say, and it is out of this, the Beacon study group, that this very excellent journal, the Beacon, was published by Gomes. He was the editor, he was the publisher, he was the financier. So it's an absolute gem, and a lot of researchers have been going back to it to look at the beginnings of a literary tradition in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, some of his colleagues at that time, who were members of the Beacon Circle, all young men, were C.L.R. James, Ralph de Boisier, Alfred, Mendez, and a number of like-minded artists and poets.
In the 1930s, before Gomes marched onto the trade union scene, workers had almost no organized representation, and employers took full advantage of the situation.
And Gomes's significant contribution was that shortly after he returned, he went straight into trade union activity and was organizing the stevedores in Port of Spain, the shop clerks in Port of Spain, the scavengers in Port of Spain, all of these kinds of people, the really oppressed of the earth, and organizing them and articulating their grievances and taking up their grievances in the city council and in the legislative council. And that is why he spent such a long time, more than a decade in the city council and more than a decade in the legislative council, because the working people of this country were very grateful to the kind of representation that he was giving them. And that is why they kept electing and re-electing him in the Legislative Council up to 1956, when, of course, he was defeated by the PNM. He was a champion of calypso. He was a champion of carnival. He was a champion of the Baptist liberation movement at a time when most of the, what one might call the decent, the genteel, the educated people of Trinidad and Tobago looked down on calypso, looked down on steel band. To them, the Baptist, the Shouter Baptist movement was an absolute sign of barbarism. So one can say the whole of the elite of the society, those who dictated what was happening at the upper levels, were against all of these indigenous forms of expression. This was one of the very active causes which he took up. And there is no doubt that it was largely under his leadership and under the vigorous advocacy of the Shouter Baptists that the Shouter Baptist Ordinance of 1917 was repealed in 1951.
During the 1950s, Gomes organized for TASPO to visit and perform in England. He championed the cause of calypsonians and steel bandsmen in a time when the society scorned these indigenous art forms.
He really stands out at a time when most of the leaders in the society considered these things only very barbaric, uncivilized expressions of people who did not know better. He, on the other hand, saw all of these things as real, genuine expressions of the culture that was emerging in Trinidad and Tobago. So that both the steel band and the calypso movement, as well as the Shouter Baptists, owe an enormous debt to Albert Gomes for having championed these cultural causes for many decades, one can say, from roughly around 1935 up to the very time he left Trinidad in 1962. He stood for elections to the National Parliament in 1945 when there was a by-election in Port of Spain upon the death of Captain Cipriani. And of course he stayed in the Parliament just for 1 year at that time, because shortly afterwards, in 1946, we had the first election in Trinidad and Tobago under adult suffrage. And in 1946 he stood again in Port of Spain. His rival at this time was the well-known Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler. But Gomes defeated Butler, and Gomes remained in Parliament from that year, 46, right on to 1956, when he was defeated by Ulrich Lee and the People's National Movement. My own view is that Albert Gomes should be given a much higher national profile, because he was the first and possibly the only person of Portuguese descent in Trinidad who took up so many causes, national causes, that he didn't have to take up, because as a shopkeeper's son and as a businessman in his own right, he was quite well off, so he didn't have to get himself involved in all of these political activities. He was saying, here we are in the late 1940s and the 50s, and there are so many people in my constituency and throughout Port of Spain that don't have a water supply, don't have an electricity supply, the roads are in such bad condition, and the mayor then told him, you know, we've heard that long enough from you. Now that's your constant refrain. And he said, yes, and it will be, because the people are constantly suffering, so I'll be constantly harassing the council. And the mayor, who was the chairman, asked him to desist and don't continue in that line, and he refused. And the mayor then ordered the police to remove him physically, and Gomes, a big 300-pound giant, he simply lay down on the ground and dared the police. He said, if you all are strong enough and can lift me out, you know, do so. And the police came and they stood around him, but when they understood the weight of the man, they decided it simply stood up, and what the mayor had to do at that stage was to adjourn the House, in which case everybody, including Gomes, had to leave because the House was now not sitting. But that's the kind of bravery he continuously exhibited, with, you know, a kind of a fearlessness on behalf of the cause of the oppressed in this country. And it is very unfortunate that at the present time, Albert Gomes is not being given the kind of recognition that he ought to be given, particularly by those groups whom he assisted so much in coming out of the darkness and into the limelight, both at the local level and, in the case of the steel band, at the international level.
Well, people, plenty people, sorry they throw down big belly, but not me. I stick in me pressure when I can't buy milk, I use sugar and water.
Like your sense of reasoning goes and comes, it won't surprise me if you call back Albert Gomes.
It was an intense period of public ridicule in which the population, particularly in Port of Spain, had regarded him now as a person who should not have ever been in Parliament, and that he didn't make any significant contribution to the political life, and therefore he was no longer welcome in his country. And Gomes and his siblings, his relatives and so on, were insulted. And after that continuity of insults, particularly during the time when he was in the federal parliament, presenting not the winning party in the federal parliament, but the opposition, which was aligned with the Democratic Labour Party here in Trinidad.
It is true to say that racial feeling has increased, and also the The whole question of color also, which was something that was more or less taken for granted in this country a few years ago, now it's definitely emphasized, and the people are sort of conscious of it.
So all of that in an ethnically charged kind of political situation ensured that Gomes and his family were enormously, and I say this with great sadness, ridiculed, and after a time he thought that he had no option but to leave his beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago and spend the rest of his years in exile in London.
It was during this time in England that he wrote his autobiography, Through a Maze of Color, as well as a small novel called All Papa's Children. Gomes made a brief return to Trinidad in 1974 for the launch of Through a Maze of Color. He died in England 4 years later in 1978.